was the embodiment of American heroism, and that the policies of the government, privatization, tax cuts, deregulation, should be aimed at letting the entrepreneur flourish. In some ways, I see the current election as not simply an argument between the Republicans and the Democrats, but really an argument about whether this Reagan era is over and we are entering a new era in which the private sector and the market should be, you may say, quarterbacked by government supervision. And to me, it's not a matter of whether the Wall Street guys are as smart as they think they are. They're not. And clearly this economic debacle shows it. But the bigger question is, are we better off taking the car keys out of their hands and handing it over to the 535 guys in the U.S. Congress with a rather spend-happy Obama administration, three branches of government in the same hands, all eager to write checks on somebody else's checkbook, named the taxpayer. So I'm a little bit worried that in trying to get rid of a bad situation, we're going to get into a worse situation.
Yeah, that raises the question quite clearly. With the legislative and executive branches being controlled by a single party, if that happens to be the outcome in the coming weeks, what does that change, if anything, in terms of prognosis for our economy and for our future body politic? Does it look quite a bit like the 1930s, where the new hero is more or less the bureaucratic hero? As you said, no longer the entrepreneur, things being stripped away from the business world and being given to Washington, the more measured, the more quote-unquote honest and responsible party.
I think this is an open question. I mean, I'm an immigrant to America, and when I came here in the 70s, the public ethos had been set by John F. Kennedy, who, you remember, basically said if you're young and idealistic and if you care, join the Peace Corps. So the public servant was seen as the embodiment of American idealism. Well, Reagan challenged all that, and I think the question is, where are we going from here? In some ways, we have not been here since the 1970s. We had the Clinton administration in the 1990s, but Clinton was carried by the Reagan tide, and his big accomplishments, free trade, welfare reform, and so on, were essentially conservative accomplishments. Clinton governed in a very centrist, in some ways even conservative way, and his flaws were less in his policies than in his person. Here, I think we have now, with Pelosi and Harry Reid and possibly Obama in the White House, you have a different configuration altogether. And you have a guy in Obama who has had absolutely no experience in ever running a business, seems to have no idea how an economic pie is created, seems to focus entirely on taking out the carving knife and distributing the pie. And in some ways, the question to me is not, are we going in the direction of socialism or Marxism or anything like that? No. But the question is, are we going more in the direction of, you could call it the European-style welfare state, where there is a greater sense of security, but much less sense of opportunity and mobility. America has been distinguished from Europe in that it's a country where the guy who's starting out in the middle or at the bottom can move up rapidly. In Europe, that's much less so. It's a much more static society. If you find a rich guy, even today in France or Germany, the chances are pretty good that he or she comes from a rich family. So success stories, while they exist, are kind of episodic. We have had a more dynamic society here in America. I personally would like to see it continue. And so I'm a little worried that this, just as in some ways the Great Depression provided a kind of pretext to introduce all kinds of programs that would be completely intolerable prior to it, here this economic crisis is going to create a political opportunity for a massive kind of government takeover of the private sector, which we may come to regret down the road.
The interesting thing is that's juxtaposed. Well, we've just raised the national debt level from 9 to 10 trillion, and we'll be on track this year to have an additional $1 trillion added to the national debt. Next year, potentially $1.5 to $2 trillion, depending on how the current financial crisis is, if and when it's resolved next year. So adding sort of the alphabet soup style populist politics and employment strategies of the 1930s comes at a very tough time, given the fact that we're already up to our eyeballs in debt, far more than we were, at the onset in the 1929, 1930, 31, 32 period, just prior to a change in administration.
Sure. I mean, America is a rich country, and when you've got a $10 to $12 trillion economy, you can afford a considerable amount of debt. We used to say in the 1980s, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, it does add up. But now we're talking about trillions of dollars. And so I think that we're reaching a little bit of a worrisome stage where you have to ask the question, is America, both in its sort of fiscal profligacy and in some ways in some of the degeneration of social habits in the country. And by social habits, I mean something simply like this. The very idea of having a society where the savings rate is negative, where you're actually spending more money than you're bringing in, and not 1 month or 2 months or not in an emergency, but on a regular basis. I mean, that is decadence in its worst sense. I'm using decadence here not in the sense of moral decadence, but societies that don't have the habits to flourish and replicate themselves. Europe is decadent in this sense that it's not reproducing, it's not replacing itself. If every 2 parents are having 1 child, that's a formula for a civilization to shrink over time. And so in some ways in the West, you could almost say that we've developed a set of bad habits. I don't think, by the way, that the bad habits are entirely due to affluence. I think a lot of it has to do with a destructive ideology that has embedded itself in the West since the 1960s, an ideology that, in a sense, has tried to divorce rights from responsibilities, and thus introduced, if you will, a certain kind of experimentation, which is fine as long as it's accompanied by consequences.
And you've documented many of those changes, and goodness, you've written half a dozen to a dozen books. Illiberal Education is the first exposure I had to your writings probably 15 years ago. And from that point forward, you've added to the list of topics to cover, many of them similarly themed. Tell us a little bit about your most recent book, What's So Great About Christianity, and why you felt it an appropriate response. What were you responding to?
Well, I've been a secular writer for the past almost 15 years and written a series of books on education, civil rights, Reagan, markets, radical Islam, and so on. I think what's interesting is we're living in a time where atheism has for the first time become a kind of serious option in our society. And these new atheists, I'm thinking of people like the biologist Richard Dawkins or the writer Christopher Hitchens, have launched a kind of public and belligerent attack on religion, specifically on Christianity. To me, even from a secular point of view, this attack is very misguided because it misses the way in which Christianity has had a shaping influence on our civilization and even on the values that secular people cherish. If you look at the Western civilization, it's built on 2 pillars, Athens and Jerusalem, with Athens referring to the legacy of ancient Greece and pre-Christian Rome, and Jerusalem, of course, referring to the legacy of Judaism and Christianity. So when we talk about the West as Christian or America as a Christian society, I'm not talking about, did Ben Franklin go to church or was Thomas Jefferson orthodox in his beliefs? No, I'm just saying that our basic institutions, property rights, contracts, separation of powers, checks and balances, the basic values we uphold as a society, the idea of compassion as a social virtue, the equal dignity of women, if you really trace these ideas, you find, first of all, that they weren't there in ancient Greece and Rome. And second, they came into the West and perhaps into the world because of Christianity. Christianity here building on Judaism. So the point I'm trying to make is that even the atheist is standing on you might say, a Christian mountain that he or she, if they had any sense of history or appreciation, would acknowledge. So I see the new atheism as a sort of a reckless effort here, you might almost say, to attack Christianity, but it's not just let's drive Christianity out of the public square so people can practice it in private. It's an effort to attack and delegitimize Christianity completely, even in the private sector. And so, in a sense, what my book does, What's So Great About Christianity, it's a sort of a intellectual counterstrike against this new atheism. But it uses the tools. I don't really rely on biblical quotes or any of that. I rely on the same history and philosophy and science. I appeal to the secular arguments that the atheists make and sort of meet them on their own terms.
You're listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. We're at McAlvany.com, McAlvany.com. Dinesh, we've seen a move towards more secular viewpoints through the schooling, through the educational system, and could it possibly be because of the affluence that the Americans have been experiencing for so long? I mean, the values that you talk about in your book, are they something that we can return to?
Well, I think that it's important for people to see these values in a little bit of a new light. And here's what I mean by that. If you read the Bible, you get the idea that Christianity is very good for people who are, you might say, broken. The leper, the beggar, the guy who's down and out. But the Bible doesn't seem to present Christianity as particularly